Hi, my name is Brian Huff, and I'm an author on Amazon.com. This is my 10th book. It's a short story there's a short story in it called Ea the Snake Worshipper from a chap's book 3. In Sparta, men like Northam were terse and militaristic. The Spartans were reveling still about their defeat of Athens. The Greek fell in love with Ea, and she did conceive before they had even tried to be wedded. Northam had been called off to war, and again ignored the pregnancy for as long as he could to avoid punishment from his family for copulating outside of marriage. Also, in their conservative culture, Ea was considered a pariah due to her peculiar faith. She gave birth when Northam returned, and the two young adults went into hiding in the hills for a day or so to dodge the wrath of their parents. They brought the infant girl to the Taygetus Mountains, as Northam explained to Ea that Sparta was only in need of more men so that they could fight in battle. Ea rested the infant on the ground on a slope they had come to where so many infants had been left to die from exposure who were unwanted. Ea turned away crying, and Northam, out of fear, kicked the child off the cliff. He immediately lied to her, saying it rolled off by accident, but deep down she knew the truth. The two Spartans never were married and agreed to keep apart to avoid attention. Ea was filled with despair and turned to her faith, snake worshipping. It involved reverence for the serpent, he who brought balance to knowledge, or energy, and to spirituality. She walked like an Egyptian, with one arm crooked up with the bent wrist representing the head of the snake, and the other that trailed down at the opposite angle backwards, symbolizing its writhing tail. She ventured to that spot on the mountain daily, in mourning for her loss. No Greek knew why she had such strange beliefs, and Spartans would ask her why she walked in that manner. She replied, "The right arm of the Lord is like a crooked serpent bestowing wrath." She was known to repeat a phrase to the priests who commented, "The right hand of the Lord doth valiantly," in respect to her devotion. This phrase was, "Be therefore wise as a serpent." After going to Taygetus for weeks, a young damsel asked her about her snake worship. She likened it to the god Prometheus. The young lady was familiar with him, saying that he had brought fire and knowledge to mankind in the beginning of ancient times. She then confronted Ea, saying that their enemies, the Athenians, reverenced Prometheus in a cult. Ea said that the snake is who she is named after, and that the name is from a land far away. Ea explained that she was visiting the place where she lost her baby. The young lady did not know that word for infant, and Ea said it is a nickname like kid for child that is from that distant nation Babylon. That day Ea climbed the steep hills up the mountainside and found an infant lying at the very spot she always made pilgrimages to, but this time there was a large snake next to the helpless child, slithering very close and sticking out its tongue. Ea instantly swooped up the baby to rescue it. She saw all this as a mystical sign, for God had granted her mercy for her fornication on the condition that she take care of this newborn. She brought back her new baby to her modest home, and soon found a mother whom volunteered to nurse it, since she had a newborn blond boy of her own. After a week she was anxious to return to see the snake, and yet she never found it again. Instead, she often discovered other abandoned babies, usually girls, but sometimes black-haired boys who were from the helots, or what we call slaves. Ea worshipped the snake fervently as she acquired a small group of crying infants. This place of hers had become an orphanage now. She hardly had time to hike up Taygetus, and she soon quit weeping for her lost child. Now she was happy again, having her quiver full of little arrows, as she would say to the men of the army who came to them out of curiosity. One day Northam returned, and she held nothing against him after he apologized. She was as harmless as a peaceful dove, but always in need for a new mother to nurse her latest foundlings. Since this generosity was so rare among the Spartans, she had many curious visitors, some of which were willing to support her courageous efforts charitably. Her joy was overflowing, and she was so thankful for the donations. Word spread, and men who were impotent or wives who were barren actually desired to adopt many of these orphans. Anon a decade had passed, and sometimes couples would bring their unwanted infants to Ea instead of to the mountains to die. The elders thought it strange, but sometimes applauded her efforts as being a new phase of civilization. The idea spread throughout Sparta, and soon there were many orphanages. Once the orphans became military-aged, the elders finally acknowledged the usefulness of her efforts. Some were even educated by the priests in philosophy and adopted into wealthy families as servants, adding to Ea's popularity. By this time, she rarely visited the mountainside herself, but depended on some of the orphan children to check for any infants who may have been left there, although the practice had ceased for the most part. Ea taught all of her children to hold the snake as sacred and to admire wisdom. They were especially adept at learning from the philosophers of Greece, and one man who was saved from certain death as an infant traveled to Athens to worship at the temple of Prometheus. The worship of Zeus had become universal in Greece centuries before, and the Orthodox would tell the story of how Zeus sent an eagle to get Prometheus for stealing fire from the gods and giving it to man. So despite Ea's philanthropy, she found it difficult to find favor in man. Most Spartans preferred to use the other orphanages that were not tainted by her snake worship. Yet she was still beautiful, and eventually fell in love with a wealthy and powerful man who had lost his wife. He had actually adopted one of the infants and made him into a helot for his household. This is how he was initially acquainted with Ea. Ea was now 40 years old and had begun a relationship with this patrician. They got married and she finally had a boy of her own delivered. The baby boy would trick her by crying until she looked at him, and then he would smile like it was all to fool her. She named him Prometheus, and he carried the torch in a relay race, winning the Olympic-type game when he was much older. She now had many pieces of gold jewelry, having married her rich husband, who coaxed her to give up her marriage to her orphanage to her successors, who she had saved from death and in their infancy. By now she was in the last years of her life, and her older husband passed away, leaving her everything. Prometheus became a war hero with many noble and heroic acts. His valor was famous for a time, but his celebration for his achievements was short-lived. Ea had fallen ill. Prometheus went to her side as she fondled a golden snake ring that was biting its own tail. She pleaded for him not to neglect her faith. Prometheus declared his allegiance to Zeus instead, and exclaimed that she was the last of her race to be a snake worshipper. Finally, he inquired how she had come to be such an adherent to that archaic religion. Ea sighed and said that it does not matter, since the Spartans would see to it that her faith would die with her now that the new gods had replaced it. She explained how war had taken the place of peace in Sparta. Bemoaning this, she pleaded with Prometheus to again accept her faith as his own. God used to be represented by a snake, but now the eagle of war has its place on our flag, with the serpent in its talons. One day someone shall uncover the ancient arts, and how the new negative energy has taken the place of snake worship. Ea was buried on the side of the mountain of Taygetus, where she had seen her child murdered in the snake by the first foundling. Prometheus inherited most of the family's wealth and visited her place of rest frequently at first. Eventually he stopped going, but returned one spring to find a den of vipers above her grave.